Thank you. So I haven't got any slides, so if you're all sitting waiting for me to press the button for the next slide, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. I'd prefer not to present with slides. This is actually, depressingly, my 35th year in procurement. And I think that makes me probably uniquely unqualified to talk about the future because, well, I guess most of you are more likely to be a part of the future of procurement than I am. But at the same time, that does mean I've got quite a lot of history. And actually, the history over the last couple of years has been probably the most informative, I think, that we've seen over perhaps the last 30 years. First, a few words, though, about Nutreco, because it's probably a business that most of you haven't heard of or come across before. What we do is we make animal feed for land animals, everything from cattle all the way down to fish farms, so all the way down to shrimp at the other end of the scale. So there's a fairly good chance, actually, your dinner last night was fed by feed that Nutreco makes. We turn over last year about 9 billion euros, and our spend is 8 billion euros. So you don't have to be a genius to work out the maths that for procurement that Nutreco is kind of pretty core. Because we basically buy and we sell, we don't add very much more in the value chain. That 8 billion euros represents approximately 10 million tons of raw materials that my team buys and moves across the planet. Raw materials I'm talking about are soy, wheat, corn, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, etc. Everything that you need to grow an animal. So obviously, the last few years have been pretty extraordinary for all of us with COVID and then the supply chain chaos that came at the end of COVID. And then Russia invades Ukraine. And I'm sure you can imagine, and everybody knows now of Ukraine as the breadbasket of the world. And obviously, a lot of the commodities that we buy, those wheat, corn, etc., comes from Ukraine. So our supply chain was thrown into chaos pretty much immediately. Now, I'm a natural pessimist. So I had actually flagged probably back in, I think it was about October, November time to my CEO. I saw Ukraine as a potential risk. So we did a little bit of prep. But honestly, we didn't prepare anything like enough. But if we had, I'm not sure that would have helped us. The reality is our business is an extremely low margin, highly competitive business. If we had fully prepared for the consequences of Russia invading Ukraine and Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, that would have been quite catastrophic for our business because we would have built in so much cost, so much inventory that we would have not been able to compete. So I think with that reflection, there are 4 key lessons that I think I've learned over the last 12 months. And those are what I want to talk about today. Now, Nina quoted Einstein a minute ago, and I'm going to continue in that vein because I'm going to quote Darwin. So Darwin, it's a bit cliched, but everyone knows now. Darwin talked about it's not the strongest or necessarily the biggest or the most profitable or the leanest stuff, I'm paraphrasing, that survive. It's the ones that are most able to adapt to the change. And for me, that was the first lesson. The first lesson for us was our speed of decision making. Now, we had a situation early on in the conflict where we had several thousand tons of material that we were sourcing from Belarus, which we could no longer get. So we had to very quickly identify a new source and get that material. Now, I'm talking several thousand tons. This is not small stuff that you can stick in the back of a lorry and move quickly and easily. This takes weeks of planning and decision-making to decide whether or not this is the right thing to do, the right place to buy it from, and we can move it and we can store it, etc. So normally a decision that would take 3 weeks, and we took that decision in 3 hours. With that came enormous risk, and I'm talking millions of euros worth of risk, because we couldn't be sure that that was the right decision. Not in 3 hours, we had to take a risk. So the first thing I'd say, speed of decision making, the 3 weeks into 3 hours. And the second thing is the tolerance of risk that brings. You cannot avoid that risk. Procurement, let's face it, is not necessarily known as a function that embraces risk warmly. We are a function that tries to do our best to avoid and minimize any kind of risk. And this was an environment where we had to really face into that and say, no, this is a risky decision we're going to have to take. The third thing I wanted to talk about was anticipation. Anticipation versus evidence. Now, we couldn't necessarily fully anticipate every crisis or every event. We couldn't have anticipated COVID. We couldn't have anticipated supply chain chaos. To some extent, we obviously did partly anticipate Ukraine, but we can't be certain. But what we can do is once the crisis has occurred, we can start to anticipate what follows. Because in the case of Ukraine, when that happened, we knew that supply was going to be constrained. Suddenly, we were going to remove a chunk of raw material from the supply chain, and if you remove supply, then prices start to increase, as they did, very fast. And we also know that when prices increase, demand ultimately starts to fall because people can no longer afford and they trade down. So there are consequences that you can reasonably predict, you can anticipate, not necessarily the crisis itself, but what follows. The fourth thing I think was key for us was about the preparation in the how. So, like I said, we couldn't predict the specific crisis that would occur. There's a huge amount of uncertainty in the world, even now, or even more so now. We can't be sure about what's going to go wrong. But what we can do is prepare how we will react in that situation. So what type of decisions will we need to take in the event of something dramatic happening? Who will have to take those decisions? What kind of information will they need in order to make those decisions as well as possible? And those things we did prepare, and those things I think are the things that we are trying to focus on now. Not necessarily trying to predict everything that could go wrong, but trying to prepare how we will react when something does happen. So I would take those four lessons: speed of decision making, tolerance of risk, anticipation versus evidence, and preparing the how. And then just a word to looking forward. So as we look forward into 2023 and beyond, and what this means for the talent that we have in procurement. Well, going back to the sort of the Darwin comment around who survives and who thrives, I think the talent in procurement that will thrive in a world of uncertainty is the type of people who are more tolerant to risk. They have a greater risk appetite. They are people who probably prioritize speed over process. And they are probably people who've got a breadth of experience that enables them to connect the dots and anticipate what is going to happen next. So I think those three things are, I think, for me, the takeaways for talent. Thank you.